Okay, so I'll just cock this shutter, put my retard gear train in position, pull back this lever so that it catches behind the protrusion on the blade actuating ring, not sitting on top of it. Put the screw in to hold this. Your two screws here look much the same. One of them's larger diameter, the other one's slightly shorter. That's the one that goes into the retard gear train. Run that down, make sure that lever's pulled back. Tighten that screw up. At the other end is this small screw. The hole that that screw goes through is slightly oversized, and that allows you to swing the the retard gear train inwards for greater engagement with the cam to slow the shutter speed down, or outwards for lesser engagement, which would speed the shutter up. Self timer goes over here. The pin on this arm comes through that slot. Oops, just fired my shutter. And the longer, smaller diameter screw goes in there. There's a screw head on the base of this that fits into a hole in the mechanism plate to locate it. So that's all in place. Let's cock the shutter again, fire it, hear it run down. That sounded a bit quick for 1 second, so I need to bring the retard gear train inwards for greater engagement to slow that shutter down slightly. I'll slacken off my adjustment screw there, swing this in slightly, tighten the screw back up. That sounded a bit better. Let's try the self timer. Cock the shutter again. Set the self timer. Release the shutter. It's now hanging, waiting for this to run down. I'll pull this tab back here. Let the self timer run down. And then the shutter releases. So that's all happening. That's working nice and smoothly. Carry on, I suppose. Swap back to this side of the paper so that you can see those items. Now I just need to clean these pieces up. Mostly this is excessive graphite grease that's been put on that plate. This is the front retaining ring. The pinion. And this piece that cocks the shutter action. It drives the pinion which cocks the main cam. It also cocks the flash sync mechanism and allows that to latch in. Now this thing, I've got a particular interest in this because this is bent and I've got to decide exactly where it's bent and how I'm going to straighten it up. Certainly something had been rubbing on the case. I suspect this. Let's just pop it and pot it in place and see what it looks like on the case. So I'll hook its spring into place. Goes over that pin there. That's sitting in its rest position. I'm looking here to see if it comes in contact with the case. It doesn't appear to, which is a bit of a mystery. It's not much out of square there, but it's a little bit out of square. Difficult to see exactly where the bend is in that arm. It could be right at this point. It's much more likely to be at a point down here somewhere where the arm is thinner. I'm going to try squaring that up with a pair of pliers and see if it appeals to me more. I think we'll see how that goes. Let's take that back out and lubricate things. So, molybdenum paste, I'm interested in lubricating the inside surface where this runs around that lens tube, the outside surface where it bears on various pieces here. That should do. You can see that there's virtually nothing on here in the way of lubrication, not like that large amount of graphite grease that was on there. You don't need much. Might make sure that's all sitting in position. Here's the little pinion. I'll just give the shaft of that a light white, just a touch really. Drop that in there. That's seated in position. Note the position of the teeth on that. I'll zoom you in a bit. The last tooth on that pinion drops into the first notch on that ring. Yeah, the shutter speeds settings cam plate. I'll wipe once around the inside, once around these cam surfaces, round that piece there where it picks up the B lever. That's typically enough. Let's put this in place. Set the shutter speed to an 8 and see what we get. Oh, that is much too fast. So I've got to swing my retard gear train in for greater engagement with the cam to slow that down. So I'm going to swing all that out of the way to cock the shutter to expose this screw. Will it come across? Yeah, it's not moving much. I might be at the limit. Okay, let's tighten it up there. More than one way to skin a cat. Get everything back in place. Make sure that this tab is correctly positioned. Put this in again and see what we get. That should be an 8. No, that's just popped under. That is miles too fast. What's it like on a quarter? Yes, certainly miles too fast. All the speeds are too fast. We're at the limit of our adjustment in terms of swinging the retard gear train inwards. There's an adjustment I can make. This pin here that follows the cam, follows these cam surfaces, I can bend that outwards which effectively means that the cam swings inwards, and that would slow it down. Normally I bend that as a last resort. We'll do it now because this is going to be, there's another way too, but let's do the simple way. I have a hollow punch here which will fit over that pin, and I can bend that pin out slightly. That should slow the shutter down. Let's see what it's like on an 1/8 now. That's much better. That's fast, but it's much better. Let's do it again. That was on a 1 second. That's not what we wanted. This is an 1/8. That's fast. What's it on the 15th? That's pretty credible. I think I'm just about there. I'm going to go and test that. I think I'm pretty close to correct there. And I'll just check everything else. I'm interested in the 1 second speed. If the 1 second speed is miles too fast, then that method's not of adjustment's not going to cut it, and I've got to move to something else. This is a bit unusual. It suggests to me that somebody had previously mucked with things to make the shutter work a bit quicker, possibly to try and compensate for the fact that the shutter needed to be serviced. We already know that somebody had graphite powder in there into an oily shutter and then trying to fix it, so maybe a bit of history here. Well, my 1/8 of a second speed was pretty good. That was pretty much spot on, but the slower speeds down to 1 second, they were running slightly fast, so I'm not going to get by with that method. Just swing this lot out of the way and remove my retard gear train and inspect it. I think it's quite possible that the pallets are not engaging enough. And the position of this lever here, this post, determines how much the pallets engage. It forms a stop for this arm, and much though I hate doing anything to this, I think that our problem lies there. I'm going to have to swing that. It certainly doesn't look square to me. I think someone's been at that. See if I can move that slightly. Not sure I achieved anything there. I think they just slipped off. Unhook that spring from that arm so it's not in my way. Alright, well, changes only need to be very subtle here, which is why I do not enjoy mucking with this. But I'll put that back in the shutter and see what we get in terms of results. It should, if I've moved that lever across, that post across as I think I have, this should slow the shutter down. Now I'll know because I was at the limit of my adjustment when I'd moved this across, so if I put it back there hard against the limit of the adjustment, I'll be able to test it again and see if I've made a difference. If I will just stop firing the shutter with my finger here while I'm trying to get this in place, everything will be good. I'll put this back together. And go and see what we've got. Because I was at the limit of my physical adjustment, it's easy to put it back exactly where it was before. If I'd had it at some intermediate position, I would never be sure that I was putting it back in the same place, so I couldn't be sure that I was comparing apples with apples. Let me go and try that and see what I get. I have those shutter speeds working very well. The key was indeed to shift that arm across so that the pallet's engaged to a greater degree with the pallet wheel. I've just put in this little stop here. That lever stops you to pressing the shutter release if the shutter's not cocked. That's the last component to go in the shutter. But as I was saying about that speed train, retard gear train, yeah, it was definitely out of adjustment. Now, whether somebody had shifted that in order to make the shutter speed up, I don't know. Whether something had been accidentally damaged or moved in terms of the adjustment, I don't know. But I do know that that was the key, that there was insufficient adjustment available by moving the retard gear train relative to the main cam, and I'm not a great fan of adjusting the tilt of that pin in order to provide greater or lesser engagement, except in the small adjustments, and I was having to adjust it more than small adjustments, and I was still not getting a good the speeds weren't good. I could get it so it would work well for the slow speeds, but the fast speeds would be too slow. Or I could get it to work well for the fast speeds, but the slow speeds would be too fast. It was just all over the place. But by moving that little tab over, allowing the pallets to engage more fully, I was able to leave myself adjustment on the position of the retard gear train, which is what I would expect to be the case in a normal shutter, and the speeds are good. So now I'm going to put the outer housing on this shutter. So first of all, I just want to clean this case, because as you get further to the outside, stuff is more open to dust and dirt and so forth, grit. These parts look pretty good to me. They're not overly dirty, they're not overly greasy, they're just looking good. I'm going to wipe these lightly with some molybdenum paste. The curved rack that's driven by the gear, and it just pushes this piece along, and that in turn pushes on this piece. That's still a mystery, that mark in the case. It's possible that that was happened when somebody put the shutter back together. If you get these two pieces overlapping, then obviously they're going to apply some pressure to that case, and it's possible that that's what's happened there. I know that something funny's happened there. Right, so see if I can get this rack and so forth in place. I've cocked the shutter, it makes it easier to get this tab in place, and I should be able to just fit this in position. I think I have. Our flash contact has to come in here, so if I turn this around, yeah, it pulled into line. So our outer case is on, it's in position. I'll get its 3 screws in place. Just glancing at the recording light on the video camera, because more often than I like, I fail to start the recording process and I get 5 minutes into a big explanation and then discover that I was talking to nobody as the camera turns itself off. That's good. Now the little screw on the side here that clamps this flash contact firmly, I'll just run that into place. That doesn't need much. Obviously just run it down until you feel some resistance and stop. You don't need to wind that thing in, you're not going to achieve anything good by doing so. Okay, here's the shutter. We can start putting the front rings in place because we're just about done here. So these pieces I'll need to clean. Again, it'll be with the Naphtha, and I just want to get all the old grease and rubbish off here. This is the piece that couples to our aperture control on the front of the camera and moves the diaphragm in the shutter. This is quite clean. It's not uncommon for this to be very buttered with graphite grease to the extent where nothing really wants to move much. This is not. It's only lightly lubricated, which certainly would suggest to me that the shutter had been serviced on a previous occasion and that whoever had done so was fairly light with the lubricant at that stage. Which seems to be a bit of a contrast to the insides of the shutter where there appeared to be too much graphite grease thrown about. So, well, there was certainly graphite, it might have been graphite powder. It was more obvious on the inside of the shutter, and that to me appeared to be graphite powder that had been used after the shutter had been, when the shutter needed to be serviced and wasn't. It's someone with a dirty shutter that needed to be serviced and with oily blades and so forth attempted to make it work better by puffing some graphite powder into the shutter, which may have had some apparent benefit, but it creates more problems than it solves. Okay, so that's on there. That moves smoothly enough. And numbers will ring for the aperture settings. And we can put the focus mount on the lens mount on the front of this. This forms our click stops for our shutter speeds. So I just gave that a light wipe with molybdenum paste. Typically that would be well lubricated with graphite grease, extravagantly lubricated with graphite grease, but there's no significant advantage in doing that. Retaining rings not wanting to run on. That's better. There's been a hard spot there for some reason. I'm just checking the action. We need click stops. They should be reasonably firm but not too stiff. Normally I just do this up until I feel that it becomes stiff and then back it up. That's definitely stiff there. Let's back it up one notch and see how that feels. Still too stiff, I think. That seems to be quite good. I'm going to leave it right there. Put my lock screw in position. That is the shutter done. All I need to do is put the lenses back in there and put it back on the camera body. First, some cleaning with a bit of naphtha. Here I'm not cleaning the glass, I'm cleaning around the body of the lens. And I'm just removing anything that looks vaguely oily, so that when I come up to the glass to clean it with a glass cleaner, I am not wiping on greasy contaminants. Call that one ready for glass cleaning. The front lens component, well, you can see that's covered in fingerprints. So someone has had that off probably at more than one time in the past. Possibly to use a wide or tele lens on there. Possibly that was just the result of someone servicing it and being a bit clumsy. But you can see the fingerprints have etched into the chrome. Well, I think that's nickel plating. Yeah, the fingerprints are etched well into that. The retaining ring, I'm going to clean this. This is often quite greasy. And often carries a lot of dust and grit because of the grease. And here was the shim. The shims are used to adjust the focus of the shutter and lens assembly to the body, and very probably the bodies were run down the production line. The focus mount and rangefinder was set to a standard, a known standard, as accurately as they could get them, and the lens and shutter assemblies were then matched to the body by the choice of shims, so that the infinity focus was correct, or that the focus at any marked distance was actually correct. And so you get a variety of shims in place. This being a thicker metal shim, you got metal shims half that thickness, and then there were paper shims in two different thicknesses as well, dropping down I think to about half at each step. Right, well, I've got these pieces here. I will clean those glass lenses. I'll start with the rear group. There's a bit of a hazy look to that inside surface, but unlike Retina, the Xenons on the Retina III's, this generation of Xenon were not prone to that uncleanable haze. So that haze that I saw on there was just the normal dirty haze that you get on glass. It would have been minuscule oil droplets, that sort of thing. Right, well that surface is clean. I'll put that lens on the shutter and clean the outside surface. Occasionally you need to take the rear group apart. This surface is much worse. Occasionally you need to take the rear group apart to clean one of the available inner surfaces, but not frequently, only very occasionally. That looks pretty good. I'm going to give that one last go over it, and just using glass cleaner on here to moisten that cotton bud. Almost inevitably with camera lenses there's a degree of oil or contamination around the edges, which it's always difficult to get the lens absolutely smear free, particularly around the edges. That's looking very nice. The front group now, again I'll do the inside surface first. And I'm looking at this, I've got light from the window beside me reflecting on this, so I can judge what the surface is like and how clean I've got it. It's not easy on this surface because it's quite strongly concave. It's much easier to judge by reflections on flat or convex surfaces. That seems good. I'm going to put this in place. When you're putting the lens on here, make sure you line up red dot with red dot. Otherwise, you can end up in deep trouble. You can't really get that lens seated in any other position, but you can get it halfway seated and jam it on. And very frequently that leads to damage to the mechanism plate. There's a pin on the mechanism plate that extends out to the front of the shutter and positions the lens mount. If you apply enough force to the lens mount, that pin can be broken away from its mount where it's riveted to the mechanism plate. And I have a good number of mechanism plates so damaged that I've accumulated over time, and really in order to fix those I would probably have to turn new pins that I could rivet to the mechanism plate, and that would be a lot of work. Okay, that glass looks good. Let's put the shutter back on the camera. Put our shim in place. Here's the camera body. Put this in place on the body. Check that it's seated. Check that the shutter's not actually cocked. Press down that. Now it's to move the film advance lever. The shutter's not cocked, so I know I've got to advance the curved rack here at least one tooth to the left from here. Let's try that. Press the film release button, move the film advance lever. I heard that shutter cock then, and now the film advance reached the rest of its stroke. That was it. That's the correct position. And holding this in one hand, I can put my retaining ring in from the back. Don't just drop it in, you don't want that hitting the glass element. And now I'll get my tool and tighten that up. Right, that leaves us with one adjustment to make, and that's to make sure that the point at which the shutter releases and that the film advance releases happens at the same point in the travel of the shutter release button. And if I squeeze this very slowly, the shutter released, but my film advance wasn't released. So I need to bring that screw up. So let's have the top of the camera off and adjust that screw. I would say that was quite an amount too, so probably at least a full turn. That adjustment is most critical for people who use cameras as they are told to use cameras, by squeezing the release very gently. Because when they hear the shutter fire, then they take their finger off the button without continuing the stroke which would have released the film advance. The screw we want is the one, if I take that button off, the screw we want is the one on the top of the release shaft down in here. And I've got a thin screwdriver. I'm getting down there and I'm going to unscrew that. One full turn. And we'll see if we have any useful result. It's usually best to do this test with the top cover in place, because otherwise the wobble that you might get on the shutter release is enough to throw off your adjustment slightly. Yeah, again I was able to release the shutter, but the film release didn't happen. So let's try more. If this is extreme, then there's an adjustment down here in the shutter I can make instead. But let's see how this behaves for us first. Because there is an adjustment in the shutter itself which affects the point in the travel that the shutter releases. Usually you don't need to muck with that. Of course, there's no guarantee someone else hasn't. Now we've certainly gone too far, because now our film advance lever's locked. Okay. Take that down, whole turn, good measure, and I think I'm going to be into the front of the shutter to make my adjustments there. No, I don't need to. That's just right. Where I've got that is just right. Okay, well, I'm going to blow out that top cover, make sure there's absolutely no dust on anything. Check my glass surfaces to make sure I haven't left my fingerprints on them. Put the top cover back in place. And put the screws in place. I think I'm done. Yeah, it's working nicely. Put the rewind back in place, the rewind knob. Now that's not working correctly. Oh, that's better. Now it's pulled right up. You can tell if you've got a problem with that if it only pulls up in one stage. It should be 2 stages and come up nice and high. First stage just raises the knob up so that you can rewind your film, and the second stage pulls the shaft out so you can take your film cassette out. Stage 1, stage 2. That's good. Some final cleaning here. I notice that there's quite a few marks here on that pressure plate. I may have to take it off and polish it. There's a little bit of a greasy mark there, and that would have been from my handling. And that pressure plate, sometimes you get marks on pressure plates if a film had been left in the camera for a very long time, and with humidity the film is bonded to that pressure plate, and you end up with effectively stuff on the plate. In other words, it's no longer smooth. I'm running my finger over that to make sure that feels smooth. You don't want any high spots. Any high spots could form tram lines down your film. Just a longitudinal scratch in the gelatine, or the film base, which would cause the to show like lines on your print. I'm just running my finger over that to make sure that feels absolutely smooth. That feels good. It's not as pretty as it might be, but it's pretty good. And the marks that are present are etched into the surface. They're below the surface. They're not high, they're not proud, and they will not scratch the film. Just making sure that the film gate area is all clean. And I think we'll call this one done. It's a much happier looking camera than it was when it came in. And that one can go back to its owner. So, thanks for watching.